The environmental assessment report arrived on a Thursday morning, and I read it 3 times before I let myself believe what it said. It was 47 pages long. 47 pages of soil composition analysis, geological survey data, subsurface mapping, and the specific technical language that engineers use when they have found something significant and are being careful about how they announce it. I am not an engineer. I am a high school history teacher. But I had grown up watching my father read documents with the patience of a man who understood that the most important information was always in the middle, never at the beginning or the end. And I had inherited that patience along with the property that had made the report necessary. The property, 7.4 acres of scrubland on the western edge of Harlan County, Kentucky. The land my parents had left me 18 months earlier in a will that had produced, in my husband's family, the specific silence of people who are trying not to say what they actually think. What they actually thought was what everyone thought, what the county assessor thought. What my sister-in-law Bridget had said directly at the family dinner the month after the will was read, with the particular bluntness of someone who considers honesty a virtue only when it costs someone else. Delphine, honey, they left you the bad one. The bad one. 7.4 acres of rocky, scrubby, underloved land that had produced nothing in the 40 years my parents owned it. No crops, no timber worth harvesting, no water feature to justify the tax burden, no development potential that any assessor or realtor had ever identified. My parents' estate had also included a 4-bedroom farmhouse on 12 acres of productive land, a commercial storage facility that generated reliable rental income, and a fully renovated lake cottage on a body of water that had become in the past decade one of the most desirable recreational areas in eastern Kentucky. My brother Marcus had received the farmhouse and the productive acreage. My sister Phyllis had received the storage facility. My brother Aidan had received the lake cottage. I had received the 7.4 acres of scrubland in Harlan County. My husband Glenn had looked at the will reading with the expression he wore when something confirmed what he had always privately believed, which was that my family had never fully valued me, and that this distribution was the final, official documentation of that truth. He had not said this. Glenn was not a man who said difficult things directly. He communicated in the register of implication and strategic silence, which I had spent 11 years learning to read with the accuracy of someone who has had extensive practice. What I had not told Glenn, what I had not told anyone, was that 6 weeks before the will was read, my father had sat with me on the porch of the farmhouse and had said something that I had been turning over in my mind ever since. He had said, "Delphine, I left you the land in Harlan County." I had said, "Okay, Daddy." He had said, "I know how it looks. I need you to not decide what it is until you've had it assessed properly, not the county assessor. A geological survey, promise me that." I had promised him, 47 pages, Thursday morning. The thing hidden beneath 7.4 acres of scrubland that my husband had never expected, and that I was only now, reading the middle of the report the way my father had taught me, beginning to understand. My name is Delphine Corey Hawes. I am 41 years old. I teach AP United States History at Harlan County High School, which means I spend my professional days doing what historians do, reading the gap between the official record and what actually happened. Understanding that the story on the surface is almost never the complete story, and teaching 17-year-olds that the most important questions are the ones nobody thought to ask at the time. I have been doing this for 13 years. I am, by all the measures available to me, good at it. I grew up in Harlan County, which is the part of Kentucky that the rest of Kentucky sometimes forgets about, and that people who are not from Kentucky forget entirely. It is a place with a specific history, coal, unions, the particular pride of communities that have survived significant hardship by developing significant stubbornness. My family has been in Harlan County for 4 generations. My great-grandparents came with the coal industry, stayed when it contracted, and spent the decades after building something that had nothing to do with coal and everything to do with land. My father, Raymond Corey, was a quiet man with a specific intelligence that operated largely beneath the surface. He had a ninth-grade education and had spent 40 years building a small but real property portfolio through the patient accumulation of land that other people did not want. He had a theory about undervalued land that he had articulated to me in various forms throughout my childhood. People see what's on top, he would say. The smart money looks underneath. I had understood this as philosophy when I was young. I understood it as literal instruction when I read the Geological Survey report at 41. My mother, Coral, had been the organizational force of the family, the one who kept the records, maintained the relationships, ensured that the practical architecture of 4 children's lives was properly supported. She had died 3 years before my father, from a heart condition that had been managed for years, and then was not. My father had spent those 3 years doing what men of his generation do when they lose the person who organized everything. He had gotten quieter, more deliberate, more focused on the things he wanted to accomplish before his own end arrived. One of those things, I understood now, was the geological survey he had quietly commissioned on the Harlan County property in the final year of his life. I knew this because Harriet Bloom, the estate attorney who had handled my parents' affairs for 20 years, had given me a sealed envelope with my name on it at the will reading. Inside was a note in my father's handwriting that said, "Get the survey done." I already started it. Contact Warren Geological, Lexington, ask for Deb Felton, tell her Ray sent you. I had sat on that note for 6 weeks because the will reading itself had required all the emotional energy I had available, and I had not had capacity left over for investigating a piece of land that everyone, including my husband, was treating as the consolation prize of an estate distribution. Glenn Hawes, my husband of 11 years, was a regional sales manager for a medical device company headquartered in Lexington. He was 44, competent at his work, and had a relationship with money that I had come to understand, over 11 years of marriage, was the most accurate map of his interior life available. Glenn related to financial matters with the specific anxiety of a man who had grown up without stability and had spent his adult life constructing a security that he monitored constantly and experienced as perpetually insufficient. This was not a character flaw exactly. It was the comprehensible result of a specific history, but it expressed itself in ways that had shaped our marriage in directions I had not fully anticipated when I agreed to it. He had opinions about my family's land. He had been having opinions about it for years in the particular way of a man who had married into a landowning family and had developed through the years of watching that family make decisions about their holdings. A relationship to those holdings that felt to me sometimes like ownership and sometimes like resentment, and that I had never fully sorted out which it was. When the will was read and the distribution became clear, Glenn's initial response had been carefully managed. He had said the right things in the appropriate company, that my parents had their reasons, that land was land, that we would figure it out. In private, the managed response had given way to the unmanaged one. He had said that the distribution was not fair, that Marcus and Phyllis and Aiden had received income-producing assets while I had received a liability, that my family had always treated me as an afterthought, and the will was the final confirmation of that pattern. Some of what he said was worth listening to. The question of whether the distribution was fair had occurred to me too. The question of whether my family had always treated me as an afterthought was one I had been sitting with for years, in the complicated way of someone who loves their family and also sees them clearly. But Glenn's assessment of the situation was driven by his relationship to financial security rather than by any deep understanding of my family or my father, and I had learned over 11 years to account for that filter when I received his opinions. What I had not told Glenn was that my father and I had a specific relationship to information sharing that he had never fully understood. My father told me things when he was ready to tell them and not before, and he expected me to hold what he told me with the same patience he had used to tell it. This was not a secret-keeping family in the dysfunctional sense. It was a family that understood the difference between information that was ready to be shared and information that was still becoming what it needed to be. The geological survey was information that was still becoming what it needed to be. I called Deb Felton at Warren Geological 4 weeks after the will reading. She said, "I've been waiting for your call. Your father said you'd call when you were ready. He was very specific about that." I said, "He was specific about a lot of things." She said, "He commissioned a preliminary survey 18 months before his death. We finished the surface work. He asked us to hold the full subsurface analysis until after the estate was settled and you had contacted us." I said, "Why would he want that?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Ms. Coreyhawes, I think your father knew something about what might be under that land, and he wanted to make sure it was yours before anyone else started asking questions about it." He was very deliberate about the sequencing. I said, "What do you mean, what might be under that land?" She said, "Let us finish the subsurface work and send you the report. It will take 6 weeks. And I'd suggest you not discuss the commission with anyone until you've read it." I had not discussed it with anyone. Not Glenn, not my siblings, not Harriet Bloom. I had told no one that I had called Warren Geological, that the survey was in progress, that my father had set something in motion before his death that was still moving toward its destination. I had simply waited 6 weeks. Then the report arrived on a Thursday morning, and I read it at my kitchen table while Glenn was at work, and the house was quiet, and 47 pages told me what my father had suspected, and what 7.4 acres of Harlan County scrubland had been hiding for longer than anyone alive had known. Before I tell you what the report said, I need to tell you something about Harlan County and what lies under it. Because the geography matters and the history matters, and both of them are the reason my father spent 40 years watching that land and never told anyone what he was watching for. Harlan County sits on top of a significant portion of the Central Appalachian Coal Basin. This is not news to anyone who knows the region. Coal shaped everything about eastern Kentucky for 100 years, and the land carries that history in its geological record the way any land carries what happened to it. But the coal industry's decline and the environmental damage associated with decades of extraction have made most people in the region think of what lies beneath the land as a liability rather than an asset. The old assumptions calcified into received wisdom. What was under eastern Kentucky land was either coal that was too expensive to extract anymore, or the environmental damage left by extracting it. My father did not share this received wisdom. My father had spent 40 years reading whatever geological literature a man with a 9th-grade education and a library card could get his hands on, and he had developed a theory, not about coal, about something that had been sitting beneath the coal measures in certain parts of Appalachia, and that the coal industry's focus on one resource had caused people to overlook entirely rare earth elements. The report Deb Felton sent me described the subsurface composition of my 7.4 acres with the specific precision of people who have found something significant and are being careful about how they describe it. Beneath the surface scrubland, beneath the thin layer of disturbed topsoil that 40 years of neglect had produced, beneath the geological layer where coal had once been extracted from adjacent parcels, the survey had identified a deposit of rare earth element-bearing minerals. Specifically, concentrations of neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, elements that are essential components of the permanent magnets used in electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, and a range of technologies that the energy transition of the past decade had made suddenly and significantly valuable. The deposit was not the largest the team had assessed. Deb Felton was careful about that in the report and careful about it when we spoke by phone after I had read the document. But it was real, it was concentrated, and its location, in a county with existing extraction infrastructure and proximity to road and rail networks, made it commercially significant in a way that a more remote deposit would not have been. The preliminary valuation in the report, described with appropriate caution about market variability and extraction cost uncertainty, put the range at between $12 and $40 million depending on extraction methodology and commodity pricing. I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time after I finished reading. $12 to $40 million. Beneath 7.4 acres of scrubland that my brother-in-law's family had called the bad one. Beneath the land that Glenn had described, in the weeks after the will reading, as a liability we would eventually have to decide what to do about. Beneath the acres my father had purchased 40 years ago when no one else wanted them, and had held with the patience of a man who understood that the story on the surface was almost never the complete story. He had known. Not with certainty, he had told Deb Felton it was a theory, something he suspected based on the geological formations he had read about and the specific characteristics of that particular parcel. But he had known enough to commission the survey. He had known enough to sequence the disclosure so that the land would be legally mine before anyone understood what it might contain. He had known enough to write me a note in his handwriting that said, "Promise me." I had promised him. I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought about my father reading geological journals by lamplight in the farmhouse, while everyone else was asleep building a theory over 40 years. Buying 7.4 acres that nobody wanted because his theory said they were wrong about what it was worth, and then dying before he could see whether he had been right. He had been right. I picked up the phone and I called Harriet Bloom. She answered on the second ring. I told her I had received the geological survey report. I told her the preliminary findings. There was a silence on her end that had a specific quality. The silence of a woman who is an estate attorney and is processing information that has significant legal and financial implications and is choosing her next words carefully. She said, "Your father told me something like this was possible. He said he wanted to make sure the property was titled cleanly in your name before the survey was complete." I said, "He told you." She said, "He told me enough to structure the estate correctly." He was very specific about the titling. Your name only, no joint marital property designation, separate asset clearly documented. I said, "He planned this." She said, "Your father was a very deliberate man, Delphine." I said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do?" I thought about Glenn. About 11 years of a marriage that had been real in the ways that mattered and complicated in the ways that also mattered. About the specific financial anxiety that had shaped his perspective on everything from our vacation budget to the will distribution. About what it would mean to bring this information into a marriage that was, and I was honest with myself about this, sitting at that kitchen table, not the marriage either of us had intended to build. I said, "I need some time to think." She said, "Take the time, but I'd suggest doing 2 things first. 1, engage a mineral rights attorney. I can give you a referral. What you have is a mineral rights situation, not a standard real estate matter, and you need someone who specializes. 2, review your marital property documentation. Under Kentucky law, property inherited by one spouse is generally separate property unless it has been commingled with marital assets. Your father was careful about the titling, but you should understand your full position before you make any decisions." I said, "Okay." She said, "And Delphine, I am very glad your father was right." She said it with the warmth of a woman who had known my father for 20 years and understood what the rightness of his theory meant. I thanked her. I sat with all of it for 3 days. 3 days of going to school and teaching the gap between official history and actual history of sitting, across from 17-year-olds who were learning that what gets written down is not always what happened. Of driving home in the evenings to a house I shared with a man who did not know what was sitting in my kitchen drawer in a 47-page envelope. On the 3rd day, I called the mineral rights attorney Harriet had referred me to. Her name was Sandra Oates, 48 years old, 20 years specializing in Appalachian mineral rights, a woman who had the specific quality of someone who has seen every version of a complicated situation and has learned not to be surprised by any of them. I sent her the report. She reviewed it and called me back the following morning. She said, "This is significant, not speculative. The survey methodology is solid and the concentration levels are real. You have a legitimate mineral rights asset here." I said, "What are my options?" She walked me through them. Develop independently through a joint venture with an extraction company, which would require significant capital and expertise. License the mineral rights to a company with the capability to extract, which would produce royalty income over time. Sell the mineral rights outright, which would produce an immediate lump sum. Each option had different risk profiles, different timelines, different tax implications. She said, "Before we go further, I need to understand your marital situation. Your father's titling was careful. This is your separate property under Kentucky law. But if you're making decisions about this asset, your husband's position matters practically even if it doesn't matter legally." I said, "My husband doesn't know about the survey." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's your decision to hold or share. But I'd encourage you to think about it in terms of what you want your life to look like in 5 years, not just what feels manageable right now." She was right. I knew she was right. The question of telling Glenn was not a legal question. Legally, the asset was mine, separately, clearly, by my father's deliberate design. The question of telling Glenn was a marriage question, and the marriage question required me to be honest, with Sandra and with myself, about what the marriage actually was. Glenn and I had spent 11 years building a life together that had real foundations and real cracks. The real foundations were the years of early partnership, the specific ease of two people who understood each other's rhythms, the children we did not have but had talked about, the house we had made into a home through the accumulation of ordinary choices. The real cracks were the financial anxiety that had never resolved despite our stability, the pattern of Glenn's family's opinions weighing more in his considerations than I had been comfortable admitting. The specific way he had responded to the willed distribution with a bitterness that revealed something about how he had always understood his position in relation to my family's assets. I had been sitting with those cracks for 3 years and had been doing what I did with most things that required patience, holding them carefully, not forcing a resolution before the resolution was ready. The geological survey had changed the timeline, because I understood. With the specific clarity of a woman who teaches the gap between official history and what actually happened that when Glenn found out about the report, and he would find out one way or another. Because these things do not stay contained, the moment of his finding out would be the most important data point I would ever have about the nature of our marriage. I chose the moment deliberately. I made dinner on a Saturday evening. Not the elaborate dinner of a woman who is softening something, but our ordinary dinner. The pasta we had made for years, the wine we kept for weekends, the kitchen that was the most comfortable room in the house. I waited until we were both settled, food on the table, the evening easy around us. Then I put the geological survey report on the table beside his plate. I said, "I need you to read something." He looked at the report, looked at me. Read the first page with the specific attention of a man encountering something technical he is not sure he understands. Read the second page more slowly. By page 5, where the preliminary valuation range appeared, he went very still. He looked up. He said, "Delphi, what is this?" I said, "It's a geological survey of the Harlan County property. My father commissioned it before he died. I received it last week." He said, "Last week?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You've known about this for a week and you didn't tell me." I said, "I needed some time to understand it first." He was quiet for a long moment, reading my face. Something moving through his expression that was several things at once. The specific excitement of a man encountering the possibility of significant money, an excitement he was trying to manage into something that looked more like concern for me. And underneath the managed excitement, something else. Something that emerged in what he said next. He said, "This changes everything. We need to talk to a financial advisor. We need to think about the best way to structure this. There are tax considerations, investment strategies, Delphine. This is a marital asset. We need to handle this together." There it was. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What do you need?" Not, "Your father was right all along." What he said was, "This is a marital asset." I said, "It's not a marital asset, Glenn. It's my separate property." My father titled it specifically to ensure that. It was my inheritance, held in my name alone, and the mineral rights assessment is part of that separate asset. He looked at me. He said, "I don't think that's right. We should check with an attorney." I said, "I have checked with an attorney, Sandra Oates. She specializes in Appalachian mineral rights. She confirmed the separate property designation." Glenn was quiet for a long time. I watched him process this. The information that the asset was mine, legally and specifically, and that the processing that needed to happen was not financial strategy but something more personal. He said, "You went to an attorney without telling me." I said, "I went to an attorney to understand my own asset." "Yes." He said, "I'm your husband." I said, "I know you are, and I'm telling you now." "But Glenn, the first thing you said when I showed you this report was that it was a marital asset. You didn't ask if I was okay. You didn't say anything about my father. The first thing was that it was a marital asset." He started to say something. I said, "I need you to hear what I'm telling you. This land has been mine since the will was read. The mineral rights are mine. What I do with this asset is my decision, and I am willing to make those decisions in partnership with you because you are my husband and I want to. But the starting point has to be that it is mine, not ours by default. Not a marital asset that requires joint management. Mine, which I am choosing to share with you because I choose to. That is a different starting point, and it matters." He was quiet for a long time. What he said next was the thing I had been waiting 3 days to hear, the data point I had structured the evening to produce. He said, "Delphine, do you understand what we could do with $40 million? Not, I hear you. Not, you're right, I said the wrong thing. Not, tell me what you need." What he said was, "Do you understand what we could do?" I said, "Yes, I understand exactly what we could do, and I need some time to think about all of it." I meant more than the money. The weeks that followed were the weeks in which I did the accounting that I should have done years earlier and had been approaching slowly without knowing I was approaching it. Glenn and I talked. Real conversations, the kind I had been avoiding in the patient way of someone who understands that forced resolution is worse than delayed resolution. The conversations were difficult and honest and revealed things that I had known in the unfocused way and now had to know precisely. Glenn had understood our marriage, I came to see, through the framework of his financial anxiety, as a partnership organized around the accumulation and protection of security. I had understood it as something with more complexity than that. These two understandings had coexisted for 11 years because we had never had enough money at stake to reveal the gap between them. Now there was enough money at stake. I engaged Sandra Oates to begin negotiations with 3 extraction companies that had expressed preliminary interest in the Harlan County parcel. I engaged Harriet Bloom to ensure all agreements were structured as separate property transactions. I engaged a financial planner, on my own, to begin understanding the tax and investment implications of each option. I also engaged Dr. Renata Morrison, a couples therapist in Lexington, and asked Glenn to attend with me. He attended. What happened in those sessions is private in the way that therapy is private. What I will tell you is that we arrived, after 8 weeks, at an honest assessment of what we had built and what we had not built and what was salvageable and what required a different kind of courage to address. We are still married. I want to say that because the story should not be read as leading inevitably to a divorce, which would be a satisfying narrative resolution, but would not be accurate. We are still married, and the marriage is different than it was, more honest, more deliberate, more organized around what is actually true rather than what is comfortable to maintain. Glenn is working, in therapy, on the financial anxiety that has always been the lens through which he experienced everything, including me. I am working on the patience that has sometimes been indistinguishable from avoidance. It is hard. It is the work of 2 people deciding, again, to choose each other, this time with a clearer accounting of what they are choosing. I selected the licensing option for the mineral rights. Not the outright sale. That felt premature and insufficiently deliberate for something my father had spent 40 years identifying. Not full independent development. That required a level of capital and operational engagement that was beyond what I wanted to take on. A licensing agreement with a mid-size extraction company, structured with Sandra's guidance over 4 months of negotiation, that gives me a royalty on the mineral extraction over a 15-year term. The first royalty payment arrived 6 months after the agreement was signed. It was more than my annual teaching salary. I sat with the number for a long time, not with triumph, not with the satisfaction of someone who has won something, with the specific feeling of someone who has received something that was always intended for her, that was prepared for her with patience and deliberateness by someone who loved her, and that arrived on its own schedule regardless of what anyone else thought it was worth. My father bought 7.4 acres that nobody wanted because he understood that the story on the surface was almost never the complete story. He spent 40 years reading underneath it. He left it to me because he trusted me to do the same. The land is mine. What was hidden beneath it was his last lesson, and my first inheritance of the kind that cannot be assessed by a county appraiser. The understanding that undervalued things, treated with patience and proper attention, eventually reveal what they were always worth. I teach that to my students every day. My father taught it to me long before I had language for it. Some lessons take a lifetime to arrive at and a moment to understand. His took 40 years and a 47-page report. It was worth every page. Whatever you have been told is the bad one, the consolation prize, the one nobody wanted, the thing left over after the better things were distributed. I want you to consider the possibility that the person who left it to you knew something the appraisers did not. Look underneath. Subscribe and stay, because the next story asks an even harder question about what we inherit and what we owe.